Our next newsmaker interview is with Senator Ben Cardin, ranking member on the Subcommittee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Interviewing the senator is CQ Roll Call's transportation reporter, Jessica Wehrman. Jessica's interview will begin shortly.
Good morning. I'm Jessica Wehrman. I'm the transportation and infrastructure reporter for CQ Roll Call, and I am thrilled today to introduce Senator Ben Cardin, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Senator Cardin was elected to represent Maryland in 2006, and he has been a leader on water infrastructure issues, resiliency, and climate change. All of these things are incredibly relevant when you consider that he represents the beautiful Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest estuary in the United States and which has been the home of innumerable crabs that I have eaten during the course of my life. Senator Cardin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, Jessica, thanks for the promo for the state of Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay. We appreciate that very much, but you're absolutely right. It's the largest estuary in our hemisphere, and it's a precious to our way of life and to our economy, and transportation is critically important to our economy as well. So we need a win-win. We need to improve our transportation, but be respectful of our environment.
Yeah, and I'll be asking about freight, obviously, because that's the subject of the day, but you really can't talk about climate without talking about freight. I mean, we are talking at such a turbulent time for transportation and infrastructure, Senator. We're due for a new highway bill. You guys just extended the current one for a year. Virtually every mode of transportation has been pummeled by the impact of the global pandemic. I know airlines just recently have furloughed tens of thousands of workers. And we really don't know what the future of travel is itself. I mean, I'm talking to you from my home. So, and you know, I am not unusual here. Most people are working from home, and a lot of these well-established patterns of transportation have been completely upended. So, and then we've got the issue of climate change, if that's not enough. So we're watching fires in the West, nearly weekly hurricanes in the South. And just here locally in DC, 100-year floods that seem to occur every few months. I'd like to start a little bit by talking about climate change. I'd like to talk about how you've seen that play out in your own state's infrastructure, particularly the Port of Baltimore and Chesapeake Bay. How has climate change impacted the movement of freight in this country, and how do you see it playing out in Maryland?
There's no question that climate change has had a dramatic impact on our infrastructure. That's why in the Environment and Public Works Committee, as we are reauthorizing the surface transportation, we put a climate section in there. We also dealt with resiliency because we recognize that on the water bill. We also dealt with resiliency. Sometimes we may not mention the word climate because of the partisan politics of it, but we recognize we need to deal with adaptation. We need to deal with resiliency. So the frequency of the storms have had major impact on our infrastructure. We see the wildfires out west. We know that the rising sea levels have had an impact on our infrastructure in our ports. So yes, we very much need to be attentive to it. We need to do that not just because of the direct impact on our environment, it's also the impact on our economy. So dealing with climate can help us with resiliency, but also can help us be more competitive globally.
You mentioned the highway bill that the Senate passed last year, which was huge because it had the first ever climate change title. The House bill is very, very different. You could argue that it is first and foremost focused on climate change. Obviously, you voted for the former. You didn't get a chance to vote for the latter. But I'm curious as to your thoughts on the House bill. And given that Congress has just approved that one-year extension, I'm wondering what elements of both bills you see being potentially compromisable. I mean, where do you see both sides kind of getting what they want with this bill?
Well, I'm very optimistic that we can get a transportation or infrastructure bill passed. The vote in the Environment and Public Works Committee was unanimous. Everyone voted for it. So infrastructure brings us together. Same thing with the Water Resources Development Act, the WRDA Act. It brings us together. The House bill contained issues beyond just the traditional issues that are included in an infrastructure bill. I strongly support the House bill, but I could understand where there would need to be some compromise in order to get a bill to the finish line. I think it will not be difficult to agree on a bill. Now, the current surface transportation, the FAST Act, expired at the end of September. Now, we've continued it under the continuing resolution, but we need to pass a long-term reauthorization of surface transportation, and we need to pass a Water Resources Development Act in this Congress. I hope we get them both done by the end of the year. If not, we will use continuing resolutions where we need to, and hopefully early next year we'll be able to pass a long-term reauthorization. I say that's critically important because the predictability of at least a 5-year reauthorization, transportation projects take more than 1 year or more than a few months to get done, and we need the predictability of a long-term reauthorization.
That was kind of the concern last time with the FAST Act. I mean, it was, I can't remember, but it was like, it felt like dozens of times that it was reauthorized temporarily. And I'm wondering to what degree that's a concern that you're just going to keep passing, you know?
Oh, it's a major concern when you're trying to do major transportation programs. For example, we got an infra grant to deal with the Howard Street Tunnel, which is part of our rail system, dealing with freight. That's a major long-term project to replace that tunnel so we can do double stacking through Baltimore on the East Coast line of CSX. So all that it can't be done on a continuing resolution. You need to have a long-term commitment in order to get that done. We're making major improvements in a lot of our transportation issues and our transit issues. We can't do that. We have the Purple Line in Montgomery County and the Washington suburbs that require a longer term commitment on the Surface Transportation Act in order to get that done. And it really is critically important, not only for our freight, but for our entire economy.
You mentioned the resiliency piece. That seems to be sort of kind of the safe space for Republicans in terms of climate change. And I'm kind of wondering, you know, to what degree has that shift in focus kind of helped to move the, I mean, ASCE talks about, adaptation and mitigation, and resilient infrastructure is part of that. But to what degree do you have to get the other piece, the piece where you're actually reducing emissions as part of it?
Oh, we need both. But when you're dealing with an infrastructure bill itself, you can deal with mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. For example, in the bill that passed our committee, we have a major provision on providing facilities for electric vehicles so that you can use electric vehicles in interstate commerce. That will significantly reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. Transportation is the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions. So to the extent that we can make it more efficient, we are reducing greenhouse gases. We are dealing with the climate issue itself. In dealing with adaptation, Democrats and Republicans, the business community fully understands the cost of not dealing with adaptation. When we see the amount of damage to our infrastructure, which takes resources away in repairing where we need to advance more modern infrastructure in our country. So we have everyone's attention on dealing with the effects of climate change. As I said earlier, we may not always call it climate change because of the politics and some of the partisan politics, but we have the business community's attention, we have the environmentalist attention, we have the business competitiveness globally needs to deal with this. So we will deal with the effects of climate in the next transportation reauthorization, as well as in the water reauthorization.
Well, I'm definitely going to talk to you about the water reauthorization too, but let me talk a little bit first about the coronavirus and its impact on freight. Early on, we saw vast shortages in grocery stores and medical supplies, flaws in the supply chain. I mean, we saw you couldn't get paper towels or hand soap for a while. So to your mind, what did the pandemic do to expose flaws in the supply chain? And is there a way, I mean, is this something that Congress can address legislatively? Is there a way to make improvements now that we've seen these flaws?
Well, clearly COVID-19 has pointed out a real security issue for America on supply chain issues. The immediate concerns were the supply chain for protective equipment, the supplies on medical for testing. That was the immediate concern as to whether we could protect the people of this country from the virus and whether we had the ability to do the necessary testing because of the dependency of supplies outside of the United States. But as you pointed out, we then recognized pretty early that we had challenges on supplies, on getting materials to the marketplace. We had the safety of those who were part of the supply chain, as well as having the materials necessary to meet those needs. Yes, Congress can do something about this. That's why we have the Defense Production Act to make sure that we have the domestic capacity to deal with what is needed in this country to keep America secure and safe. We need to utilize that more aggressively than it's been done under this administration. We also need to develop domestically the capacity to deal with pandemics or any type of an emergency. We had those plans in place. The Trump administration dismantled the protection we had under the National Security Council to deal with a pandemic. We got to reconfigure that so that we can deal with any emergency in this country and be self-sufficient to take care of the needs of the people of America.
What was the impact on the Port of Baltimore? I'm curious because we heard a lot about trucks, but we didn't hear as much. I mean, there's such an important part of freight is ports, and I'm curious as to whether or not they saw similar issues. It did not get the attention that truck freight did.
Yes, and we have our federal delegation has been in contact with the Port of Baltimore, and we have a new administrator, and we've been in conversations. The revenues have been pretty dramatically impacted, as all ports have, and that's just the amount of commerce has been significantly reduced because of the economic downturn. We have protected the Port of Baltimore in regards to the direct impact of COVID-19. And it's interesting, some of the discussions we've talked about, I am proud that the Port of Baltimore just received a $10 million build grant to deal with resiliency at the Dundalk Marine Terminal. So we are making those preparations. Prior to COVID-19, the Port of Baltimore was prepared for the larger cargo vessels as a result of the Panama Canal expansion. So the Port of Baltimore was in very good shape. We're now doing some additional improvements in the Port of Baltimore so that we can bring in even more vessels. So I think the Port of Baltimore is in better shape than most ports in coming out of COVID-19, but make no mistake about it, every port in this country has been adversely impacted by the virus.
Are you concerned about supply chain interruptions going forward? I mean, we've got the holidays approaching, and that's always a big freight time. And I'm curious as to what we're going to see in the future. The pandemic hasn't gone away.
Well, I am confident that the ingenuity in this country will deal with this crisis, and we'll figure out ways. And as we look today, we see that we have caught up to where we needed to be. We were behind in the beginning. We should have been better prepared. As I pointed out earlier, I think what the Trump administration did was wrong. They should have used the Defense Production Act more aggressively, and they certainly should have been better prepared to deal with this crisis. But I am confident that American ingenuity will make sure that we have adequate supplies, but we just can't take that for granted at the governmental level. We need to make sure that we have the policies in place that make that easier to protect this country. Recognize at times the economics of it may require the government to provide assistance so that we have that reliable supply chain here in America.
I want to talk about sort of the long-term impact of how we get around. I mean, as you have to kind of do a little bit of a prediction when you're writing a highway bill, like this is the needs that we will have in the future. And those needs have really changed dramatically. I mean, people have changed the way they commute. Transit was something that Democrats had emphasized quite a bit, but right now there's still a considerable slowdown. So I guess I wonder what kind of long-term impact you think that the pandemic's going to have on how we get around, and like, what does transportation look like when we get out of this? This is your chance to be like Nostradamus.
Well, Jessica, thanks for that question, because it's a very interesting question. I commute to work from Baltimore to Washington. I live in Baltimore and I commute. And that commute time by car can take anywhere pre-COVID from, I guess, an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours and 15 minutes in each direction. Since COVID-19, I've been able to do that in under an hour in each direction because of so much less traffic being on the roads. And I must tell you, our environment has also benefited pretty dramatically from COVID-19 in regards to less use of of transportation vehicles that have added to our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's one of the positive impacts that we've seen in recent months. What will happen post-COVID-19? Well, one of the things that concern me as we look at our transit systems, they have had a tremendous hit of revenue as a result of COVID-19. As I said, all the transportation modes had. We have to make sure coming out of COVID-19 that we have a robust transit system in place, because it's more economical for people getting to and from places to use transit, as well as it's better for our environment. So one of the planning procedures is to make sure we don't give up on mass transit. We need to continue to invest in mass transit. We also, as we point out, recognize that the volumes will increase again on our roads. We have to make sure that we have the bridge replacements that are necessary. In Maryland, we have several very old bridges that need to be replaced, and we're working to make sure that is done, because it's important for safety, but it's also important for commerce. Both need to have a modern infrastructure. We need faster ways for people to be able to get around. That's why some of the high-speed alternatives on mass transit need to be invested in order to bring people a safer and quicker option to get to and from places in a more environmentally friendly way that's better for the issues we've already talked about. So coming out of COVID-19, we need to recognize that we've lost a lot of jobs. Some of those jobs are not going to come back. Investing in green transportation alternative programs will not only help our environment and help deal with the problems of resiliency and climate change, it will also create good jobs that are necessary in our economy. So that's where I hope we will be coming out of COVID-19.
What do you anticipate that it'll take to get people using airplanes and transit again? I mean, when do you think the public's going to be reassured that these are safe?
Well, I think there's going to be an age difference here. I think younger people are already starting to use the airplanes, the planes, and are doing things that are look to be a too high of a risk for people who are vulnerable today. So I think until we have a vaccine that is widely been utilized, that's safe and it's effective, until we have widely available therapeutic drugs. We see that the president's had access to a significant amount of therapeutics. Once that's available to the general public, so that if you do get sick, your chances of recovering are much greater than they are today for people who are vulnerable. I think it's going to be difficult to restore the confidence to widely use the air service, or to widely use transit service, or to widely use those forms of transportation that require close contact. Even though we can make it safer, I think the public's not going to embrace those modes of transportation until they feel that they are protected either through a vaccine or therapeutic drugs.
At the same time, we've got an aid package that seems to be completely stalled right now. The airlines have begun furloughing people. What's the outlook in terms of getting something else passed for not just airlines? I mean, the most recent House bill had something for Amtrak and for transit as well. Do you see any sort of path forward, or do you just feel like it's stalled?
Jessica, I'm so disappointed we haven't passed it already. We should have passed this months ago. The House passed their bill in mid-May. So we're now, close to 5 months past the time when the House has acted. We really are desperate here. We need the money for those who are unemployed, their unemployment benefits. Taxpayers need that extra check in order to have confidence to go out and participate in our economy. We need it for schools to reopen in a safe manner, whether it's a hybrid system, an in-class or virtual. They need those resources. State and local governments are laying off workers because their revenues are down, and they need help. The bipartisan plea by our governors has gone unanswered. Small businesses, which I am directly involved with Marco Rubio, the Republican chair. The two of us, I think, can come to an agreement, but we need a bill in order to put it into to help small businesses. Our original CARES Act PPP program was for 8 weeks. This pandemic has gone much longer than anyone has anticipated. We need to help the businesses in our community. Homeowners and renters are in danger of losing their homes or their properties. We need to provide help so that they can not only avoid foreclosure, but have the resources in order to be able to pay their rents and mortgages, so that the financial institutions and the landlords have the money that they need in order to pay their obligations. It's really a chain reaction here. And yes, we do need to make sure the transit systems can continue to operate. We need to provide funds there. We need to provide money to make sure this election goes along safely and securely in November. All those issues, United States Postal Service is in desperate need of resources. The CARES Act worked. Mid-March, in March, we passed that. Democrats and Republicans came together. We need to come together, Democrats and Republicans, and pass this HEROES Act immediately. We can't wait till the election. And I applaud Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer for being willing to compromise. It's time for Mitch McConnell to come to the table, and let's get this done now before the election. If we wait till after the election, there'll be thousands of small businesses that'll be shuttered forever that we could have saved. There's going to be many, many people that have become homeless. Our schools are not going to be operating the way they should. Our economy is not going to be back where it needs to be. And yes, we endanger our infrastructure for transportation and commerce because they desperately need the help that's included in the next round of COVID relief.
Let's talk about something that Congress seems to agree on, but has not sealed the deal on. WRDA I've covered the markups. It seemed kind of like a love fest. It was very refreshing. Do you feel like the conference is going to, do you feel like conference, can you break some news here?
Right, certainly.
Is this lame duck stuff, or is this, are we going to see this before you guys, when do we see a WRDA?
Well, you're right. WRDA was a love fest. We had that unanimously, and I think just about every senator has important projects that are in the WRDA bill to help their state and their communities. There's some, I would say, secondary issues that are still outstanding. The role for the Army Corps in certain projects, there's some differences there. There's some individual senators that are still trying to negotiate some additional provisions. And we are very close to an election. I don't know whether that acts as a positive or a negative right now. So we're not in session. We don't anticipate to be in session other than to vote on a COVID-related package or the Supreme Court nominee. So I think it's unlikely we will get to a WRDA bill or an infrastructure bill, for that matter, until the lame duck session.
Do you think it will be lame duck, or will it be pushed to next year?
No, I think we could get it done.
I kind of say the question is like I wanted to.
Right. It's the same thing with COVID. You know, there's a good chance we could get both of them done in a lame duck session. But let me tell you something. Once the realities of November the 3rd click in, when people realize what has happened, it can harden some positions and say, gee, aren't we going to be better off handling this next year? So it could change the dynamics in a way that's hard to predict. That's why we say lame duck sessions are always difficult to predict. But I think there's clearly the support in the United States Senate to pass both a COVID bill and a WRDA bill. And I must tell you, I think there's also could be support for for a surface transportation bill. I say that because I've had lots of conversations with Republican colleagues in the Senate, and I know there's significant support for COVID-related legislation, for transportation-related legislation, and certainly for the Water Resources Development Act.
With water resources, you said is mostly secondary stuff. I know one of the big issues in the House side was the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Is that something that you're on board with? Like, let's free up that funding and get it out so people can actually use it?
That issue is not a secondary issue. That's certainly an important primary issue. And yes, we would love to see that money get out there. As you know, it's been used for bookkeeping and not getting out to do what we intended it to do. And yes, we would like to see that money utilized.
Are there other issues with WRDA that you think should sort of necessitate it getting done sooner rather than later?
There are other issues. As you point out, our conference works in a strange way. We don't have a formal conference. It works through our committee leadership, which includes Senator Capito, who's the chair of the subcommittee, and myself as ranking member, and certainly Senator Brasso and Carper. And I can tell you the four of us are very much interested in trying to resolve these last issues. But some of them have been stubborn and they're not primary issues. So we have a few issues we have to resolve. We hope we can take care of that. We also have the issue of whether we deal with clean water and how we deal with clean water. So there's some other issues as to whether we have one bill or two bills, whether you have a trailer bill. There's different jurisdictions in the House than there is in the Senate. Those issues make it a little bit more complicated to get to the finish line.
Senator, this has been such a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you so much. I know it's been a very, very crazy few weeks. So the fact that you were able to sit down, I have a lot of gratitude for. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for covering these subjects. These are important subjects. They don't always get the attention that they need because of the other issues being in the headlines. So thank you very much for covering this, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you to Senator Cardin for participating in today's event. Closing out our newsmaker sessions will be Congressman Sam Graves. Congressman Graves represents Missouri's 6th Congressional District and is the ranking member of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. CQ Roll Call's Jessica Wehrman returns to interview the Congressman. Jessica's interview will begin shortly.
Hi, I'm Jessica Wehrman, and I cover transportation and infrastructure for CQ Roll Call. And I'm here today with Congressman Sam Graves, who is the ranking Republican on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Sam Graves is a natural fit for a senior position on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He basically grew up on the airfield that sits in the middle of his family farm. That airport, the Gould-Peterson Municipal Airport, is named after Graves' uncle, a B-24 pilot who was killed in World War II. Graves himself is an accomplished pilot with, now correct me if I'm undercounting this, more than 3,000 hours of flight time. Where are we at now?
It's about 4,500.
Okay, so yeah, I undershot that by a little bit. We'll round up. He represents the 6th Congressional District of Missouri, a state that is an epicenter for so many modes of travel. For example, the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers are in your state, and his district covers more square miles than 9 US states. So transportation is kind of a big deal for his constituents. So he's brought his expertise in aviation and other modes to the committee, and we are so glad that he is here to bring us that expertise today. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it because you are joining us at an incredibly crazy time. So we're talking at a time when we've got a pandemic, an election, and on a wonkier level, a surface transportation bill. Let's talk first about the latter. So Congress just has passed a 1-year extension of the FAST Act because the bill that House Democrats passed this year and the bill that the Senate EPW committee passed last year were completely different. You've made it clear that of the two, you kind of preferred the Senate bill, and you've criticized the House Democratic bill as kind of a Green New Deal sort of initiative that was doomed to fail. You also presented your own plan, which was very different from what the House Democrats passed. Will you start by setting the scene for next year? I mean, do you think that a long-term bill is achievable? Where do you see as areas of compromise? And are we going to keep seeing extensions? I remember the last time, right before the FAST Act, there were like dozens of extensions. Are we going to see that again?
Well, hopefully we don't, because it really hurts state DOTs when it comes to the planning process and trying to figure out what projects they can move forward with, what projects they can complete. And particularly when you get into the construction season, that was one of the reasons why we were pushing so hard for a year-long extension, so that we don't get into to that routine. And I think both sides would agree that, you know, it's just not healthy for state DOTs when it comes to planning. So that gives us kind of a restart, I guess, and obviously a lot depends on what happens in the election. But it gives us some time to work on a new bill and come up with something that's bipartisan, which I think, you know, nothing will pass if it isn't a bipartisan bill, and that's always been the tradition of the committee right up until this last one. And so hopefully we'll see this restart be much more productive.
What are your do or dies for this new highway bill? I mean, and are there areas where you can, from the bill that the House Democrats passed, that where you think this is something that we can work with? I mean, what are the things that you really need to see in a long-term extension?
Well, I don't have any do or dies. I mean, I'm open to anything, and I told Peter, when we started working on this, that don't just assume that that I'm or my conference is going to be against everything. Give us the opportunity to talk about it. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in this last bill, but we did introduce our own. We have several things we would like to see in a bill. I want a new highway bill to focus on those core principles. And the main thing being roads and bridges. Obviously cutting government red tape and speeding up the process of getting projects done, giving states more flexibility when it comes to being able to determine, what those projects are. We also need to make sure rural infrastructure is taken care of, and we need to make sure that technology is considered as we move forward with transportation. And then, of course, there's making sure that the Highway Trust Fund is, viable for the foreseeable future. And right now, we obviously have a situation where it's not. It's declining. Revenues are declining. We have more vehicles on the road that are more efficient. We have more vehicles on the road that don't even buy gas. So those are some of the things that we would like to see in a highway bill.
The bill that the Democrats introduced was very, very green. It was a very your Democratic counterpart, he described it as transformative, and he said, climate change is kind of a non-negotiable for our side. Republicans have not talked as much specifically about climate change, but they have talked a lot about resiliency and resilient infrastructure that can withstand major events. Moving forward, do you see this debate when, as infrastructure relates to climate change? I mean, do you see the focus being on the resiliency piece? It seems to be the one place where both sides are really coming together on this particular issue.
Well, that's what I think. Yeah, and that's what I think we need to focus on, because regardless of climate change, you're still going to have, major weather events, which we have always had, and we need to make sure that the infrastructure is able to withstand those. Climate change, no matter where you're at on the belief of whether or not it's man-made or natural, whatever the case may be, it's not going to end tomorrow. We're still going to have weather events. So I think we need to concentrate on resiliency. And again, we've always said, don't cut us out. Don't just assume, never assume anything. And Garrett Graves on the committee has been working real hard from the standpoint of resiliency and moving forward. And we need to stick with that. We don't have to, it isn't an all or nothing. And as you put it earlier, do or die, we don't have those. We don't look at it that way. Let's talk about it, come up with a compromise and move forward.
Do you see limiting emissions as something Republicans are open to? I mean, there was two parts of it, the resiliency part and then kind of limiting emissions on the other end. Is that something that?
There's nothing wrong with limiting emissions, and that's something that, we continue to look at and continues to happen regardless of legislation. Industry is looking to limit that, and we're seeing more and more vehicles out there that again use alternative fuels, whether that's CNG or propane or electric or whatever the next new technology is going to be, and we need to keep that in mind as we move forward when it comes to obviously funding highway projects moving forward. So
you started talking about the Highway Trust Fund, which that always seems to be coming into this beat. I thought that was sort of the big standoff, really. You have been one of the top advocates of VMT. That's the vehicle miles traveled method for those who are uninitiated. It's basically charging you per miles traveled. There are pilot projects, I think, in Oregon and some other states. But even the groups that advocate for this method say that it's not really ready to be deployed on a national level yet. And I know your bill and the House Democrat bill would create national pilot programs for VMT. So how do we get from here to there? How do you actually make it from something that's a pilot and something that's that states are experimenting with to something that's adopted on a widespread basis? I know there is some skepticism about the privacy. I mean, how do you actually make this a reality?
Well, there's a couple of misconceptions in there. The first one is that, we're not ready for that to deploy, which is absolutely ridiculous. We can deploy it immediately. And for people that are already, they're buying gas, that we still have the majority of our vehicle fleet is buying either diesel or a gas. We just do it at the pump exactly the way we're doing now. And that is, you just have a formula at the pump, figure out what the national miles per gallon are, and you multiply that times the VMT, whatever we set that at, and it's just calculated into into your fuel price at the pump, and it's collected at the pump exactly the way it is now. And the other misconception is that privacy issue. We're not talking about tracking or GPS devices or anything like that. We're just going to do it at the pump exactly the way we are doing it now. The only difference will be is, right now it's just a simple tax that's added on to the price of fuel, and the other way is it's just a simple formula, that is again added on to the price of the fuel. And so I also think it's important too that we don't layer a new tax on top of the existing tax. We got to end one on date certain, and we start the new one on date certain. I don't want to see individuals and families burdened with a new tax layered on top of. And I also want to keep it revenue neutral, at least for the time being, and so that people don't see a change. And in fact, if you're buying gas, you're not going to see any change whatsoever. You're not even going to notice change.
So could you walk me through how that works? I pull up, with my little Civic or whatever, and I mean, it's just basically based on a formula that it would be added to the pump price.
You just come up with whatever the national average is going to be for miles per gallon. Let's say it's 15 miles to the gallon, and and then that's multiplied by whatever the VMT might be. Let's say it's a penny, and so it's just factored in at the pump price. When your total comes up, just exactly the way it is now, and it's collected exactly the same way. So there doesn't have to be any new technology.
How does that work for electric vehicles?
Well, electric's going to be the only, and you can deploy that pretty easily too when it comes to all other alternative fuels except electric. That's the hardest part, is how do you, and no matter what you look at when it comes to electric, you can't figure out how to charge based on the amount of electricity you're drawing, for charging. So we're going to have to go through it. And the way most of the pilot projects have worked is people that own electric vehicles will probably just pay the difference whenever they do their registration each year. What is the difference in your odometer reading last year compared to this year? And something as simple as that, and they're just going to pay it that way, or they can do it quarterly or whatever the case may be.
Let's spend a little bit of time on talking about the pandemic. We are talking at a time when the House Democratic leadership and the administration are working on a deal regarding extension of the payroll support program for airlines. And, we just got news today that American Airlines, that United Airlines are beginning to furlough employees because the CARES Act, which was passed in March, their payroll support program is expiring. So this aid is very much supported by airlines and labor unions, but some economists have said this can't be infinite. We can't keep, re-upping and re-upping. And at some point, we're going to have to stop holding up the industry. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on this, and what's the balance between keeping an industry that's hurt by no fault of its own alive versus making sure taxpayer dollars are spent responsibly? Where's the sweet spot for the government on that?
Well, we can't let the airline industry collapse. If it does, our economy is going to collapse with it, and we are going to have to prop it up. And again, it's, as you mentioned, it's not due to any bad business decision or decision made by corporate. This is as a result of the government. That's what's put them in this position. So I absolutely think we need to push that or plus it up through April. And ultimately though, it isn't about continuing to prop up the industry. We're going to have to get the country moving again. We're going to have to open the country back up. And that's exactly right. It isn't indefinite. And I don't think we should continue to have to prop up the industry indefinitely. We need to get the country open. That's the answer. Open the country back up and, and get air travel moving again. It's a vitally important part of our economy and just the movement of people, goods and services all over the country. And it needs to be going again. The economy has to be opened up. We can't, it isn't just the airlines. It's every small business or big business that's out there as well. Job creators, depending on what sector you're in, some are actually flourishing as a result of the pandemic and some of the way people are doing business now, but some are just struggling and literally, hanging on by their fingernails to try to stay alive.
What do you think it's going to take to get people flying again?
Well, the biggest thing is just, opening it up. You look at, not come out here and go home every single week. Mm-hmm. And you have, and I usually fly Southwest Airlines because they, have the best options for me. And right now they're leaving all of their middle seats open, and that's kind of a requirement. And many times the plane is full except for those middle seats. And so it would certainly help out considerably if we could open those up. And I don't know if that even has that much impact. It's just hard to tell at this point, but sooner or later, we're going to have to do something. The pandemic isn't going away. It's not going away. We're going to live with this just like we do the flu. And, we need to consider that. We just can't keep the economy shut down forever because we're spending money we don't have. That's the bottom line. We're spending money that we don't have from the federal government. And, we've got to turn this thing around.
So the payroll support program that I'm asking you about, passenger airlines took the bulk of it. They took $25 billion. And this is a more freight related question because we are here, talking about freight today. The cargo airlines only spent a fraction of the $4 billion that was allocated for them in the payroll support program. And in fact, in some of the bills that exist to renew that, it's a lot less that's allocated for cargo airlines. Why is that? Why didn't they wind up using it to the same degree payroll support that the passenger airlines did? Well,
passenger airlines or passenger transportation from the airlines, fell to significant lows, and are to almost zero there at one point in time. But what's interesting is their cargo actually increased. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of people were staying at home and they were shopping at home. I think a lot of people didn't want to go out. And so they were doing their shopping at home and it shows up at your doorstep and it's easy. And so that all means air cargo, because so much of that is moved around the country, through air cargo, and then it gets on a truck and then it makes its way to your house. But it's, and prior to that, some of those goods are brought in, obviously, in the United States through, shipping or whatever the case may be. But that's kind of the new norm, and it increased. So a lot of the brick and mortar businesses that people used to go out and visit all the time, folks just quit. They just stayed at home, and so air cargo flourished. And that's a little bit of a maybe an over or an exaggerated view, but they are doing very well, as compared to passenger airlines. So it's just kind of the new norm.
So we've all heard about the supply chain issues that were highlighted by the pandemic. What long-term lessons do we draw from the initial disruptions? And we all remember when you couldn't get toilet paper for months, or paper towels, soap, that was a big thing. So, are there long-term lessons, and is there a way Congress can weigh in to sort of make sure that the supply chain isn't disrupted if, God forbid, we have a future event like this again?
Yeah, and all those individuals were essential workers, and that supply chain was, is vital. And we found out, maybe even that it may be more vital than we ever thought before. But that's just like everything else. If you don't have a good supply chain, you're not going to be able to get those goods, services, food, whatever the case may be, to the individuals out there that need it. So we have to do everything we can to maintain that steady flow and on that supply chain to make sure it's safe and accessible. And I think, we learned some vulnerabilities from that, and we're correcting that, or going through the process of correcting it, but we want to make sure that we are not vulnerable, and that isn't, the weak link in that process.
What would be, how, is there a role for Congress in this, or is this something where sort of the market takes care of itself?
Well, market will take care of itself a lot, but Congress's role is to get out of the way, to be quite honest with you, and not hamper it, any more than any more than it should. And that's the biggest thing, is Congress needs to get out of the way and make sure that, that we don't, stifle that chain of transportation.
What permanent changes do you think we'll see in how we move goods and people? I am talking to you, I'm telecommuting, I'm talking to you over a screen, whereas in the old days, good old days, we would have been talking in person. I'm wondering if we have a future where we're just going to see a lot more telecommuting. And I guess I'm wondering, how do those changes influence public policy related to transportation? You were talking about a highway bill, but we don't really know what the demand for highways is going to be coming out of this. It's very hard to plan when things are so uncertain. So, what do you see the future as in terms of?
I think we'll ultimately get back to more normal, or what we considered normal before this. I do think there will be more telecommuting, but I also think that people by and large, and I hear this when I move around my district and get out there, they're tired of being inside. They're tired of, not being able to be social, and they're wanting to see that more normal atmosphere, at least the normal before this. So I think most of it's going to come back. I think we will get back to an equilibrium, and I think there will be some more telecommuting. I think there will be more working at home, but I would venture to say, we're going to get back to 80% of where we were before, and I think it's going to happen fairly rapidly too, particularly when we get a vaccine and people are feeling a little bit safer about being social.
Okay, wonderful. So, talking a little bit about, Congress has handled everything from transit to airlines, Amtrak in sort of its pandemic response. The truckers groups have not really asked for, any sort of specific relief, but what they have talked about is tax relief. Specifically, some organizations representing trucking groups have talked about the need for excise tax relief, but it's not unanimous. There's other groups that say that really only benefits the large operators. I'm wondering how you help out the freight industry. We have been obviously very reliant on them during this pandemic. So how do we sort of smooth the way to make their lives a little easier as we depend on them so much during this time?
Well, that's a good question, and there is not a consensus, as you pointed out, within the industry, and I think that's something that we need to wade into, carefully. I do think that, again, government needs to get out of the way, but I think we need to wade into that and see if there is some sort of consensus. But nothing's going to move forward unless there is a consensus. That's something that Congress needs more than anything else, is when you divide an industry, and members of Congress tend to stay away from that at any cost, and it's just not something that people necessarily want to wade into. So it's a good question, and everyone's exploring different ideas and different thoughts, but again, that consensus issue is what kind of keeps that, I guess you might say, on the back burner.
It seems the consensus is more on things that will make life easier for truckers in terms of parking and regulations that make it, hours of service.
Hours of service.
On the regulatory side. Am I right in that?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So, okay, I'm hoping you can break some news. What's the update on, this is also freight related, but we're moving modes. We're going from the road, from freight on the highway to freight via water. What is the conference update on WRDA? Are we going to see it pass this year? If so, when?
I think we'll see it pass this year. We had a good bipartisan bill came out of the House and out of House committee. We're waiting on the Senate, but it was a good bill. It was a good process, and it's kind of greased. We are pre-conferencing some of the items, which helps grease that process. So if I were guessing today, I think it'll happen in that November, December timeframe. I think we'll have it done for the end of the year.
Are there big points of contention that still need to be hammered out, or is it?
There's really not. I mean, we got so much of the stuff out of the way, and I'm specifically speaking to the House bill, but I don't see any real big points of contention at all.
Are you like similarly, I mean, your Democratic colleague, Pete DeFazio, is like, he has a super big bee in his bonnet about the whole Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, making sure it's deployed for its intended purposes. Is this something that's a similar, like, burr in your saddle? Is this something that you equally are irritated about?
I feel the same way about it. It does need to be used as intended. And, Pete and I are in complete agreement on that. And it's something that needs to happen. And it's been a frustration with both of us for some time. And as you pointed out, that bee in the saddle. But,
we mixed metaphors there. I like that. Yeah, I was wondering if you were as passionate about that issue, because he really gets fired up about that as he does a couple of other topics. So, okay, let's talk about air really quickly as well, because it seems like we're kind of, we're running out of a little bit of time. So I watched the committee by voice vote last month approve its Boeing bill. This is the first major legislative reaction to the 2 Boeing 737 MAX crashes. When do you see that bill going to the House floor? It was overly bipartisan. It was like overwhelmingly bipartisan. Basically, everyone seemed to be very much in agreement about it. But when do you see it going to the floor? And is this a first step, or is this kind of a last step? I mean, where is this in terms of the process of making sure this doesn't happen again, or it's made as preventable as humanly possible?
Well, it's hard to, it's hard to make disasters preventable unless you have, qualified individuals in the cockpit that are capable of handling, an emergency. So we can try to provide guidelines. And the United States is the gold standard when it comes to safety and when it comes to training and everything. And we can provide guidelines, but we can't have any influence on foreign carriers, or foreign nations and what their attitudes are or their qualifications are. And, it would be nice to be able to wave a magic wand and say, this is never going to happen again. But that's obviously something that you can't say. This is a process. And, we did pass a pretty decent bill out. We negotiated a good bill. And that's how you move legislation forward, is when you negotiate and then you ultimately come up, it's give and take. You ultimately come up with a bill that everyone or most parties can support. And so we'll move forward with that. It's hard to tell what the timeline is going to be. I mean, obviously that's up to the speaker. And I know Peter's pushing her pretty hard to try to get it up. It's possible we could have it in November. It's possible that the Senate could pick up the House version. The Senate dropped their process back in September. And now that the House has moved a bill that did pass bipartisan, I think it's possible they could pick it up and we could see this implemented as soon as, the end of this year as well. So.
You're beginning to make me think that the lame duck period is not going to be very lame for me in my beat.
Well, it all depends on the election, there's various scenarios that can play out in all of this. And so now we're in that wait and see mentality, and we obviously will finish up tomorrow probably, and or later tonight, and and then we'll see what happens in the election.
So one final question. We are in this incredibly transformative period for transportation. This is a big question. This is my sort of big picture question, I guess. So, I mean, it's an amazing time for transportation. And that's kind of even before the pandemic. I mean, we've got drones that are increasingly being thought of as the next big thing for package delivery and freight. We've got automakers and probably, moving on to truck freight, who are increasingly relying on self-driving technology. What predictions do you have for the future and how we move goods? I mean, what do you see? I'm kind of asking you to sort of play the role of like fortune teller here, but what do you see moving forward as as we kind of go through this transformative time. And, you know, obviously we've got the pandemic, so that's really kind of changed a lot of, you know.
It has, and that's actually driving some of it too, is the pandemic and people wanting to, in some cases, distance themselves from individuals. It's just like deliveries, that sort of thing. But technology it's fascinating, some of the things being worked on out there and what industry is coming up with, and you know, we're just at the very beginning of you know, some really neat new things that are out there on the horizon, and that's something that we need to be thinking about as we start looking at these transportation bills moving forward. You know, whether that is in WRDA or surface transportation or aviation reauthorization or whatever the case may be, we need to be thinking about these things and what needs to be incorporated as we either build or repair or maintain, you know, the systems out there. You know, and that's the hard part, is thinking outside the box in terms of what, you know, what needs to take place to foster this growth in technology and not stifle it. And that's what I worry about more than anything else with government. We tend to government tends to stifle more than it fosters. And so, you know, that's the thing that worries me a little bit about technology. But it's pretty neat, some of the stuff.
Wonderful. Well, you have been so gracious with your time. I really appreciate it. And it's always such a pleasure to talk with you. So thank you very much for joining me. Hopefully the next one of these interviews we can do face to face.
Absolutely. Sounds good to me.
Thank you.
Mhm.